Shift 2 Unleashed is the sequel to a previous game that I reviewed for Quids In. The title of the game seems to downplay the fact that it's part of the Need for Speed franchise. Perhaps it's trying to distance itself from the more crazy street racing style it's more known for. Shift 2, just like the first, attempts to take a more serious look at track racing. From what I can tell, pretty much everything has been improved between the two games. It looks better, it runs better, it sounds better, no accounting for music taste though, I prefer to mute that, and has a much wider selection of tracks, cars, and single-player career races, and customization and tuning options beyond. If there's one major oddity that I could point out though, it's that the cars initially feel quite strange on a gamepad. The first thing they have you drive in the career mode to figure out how your settings should be is a Nissan GTR, and I have never felt more like I was sailing a boat than I did at that time. And everything else felt just as bad. Heavy, unresponsive, hugely understeery and slow. With some tweaking in the options, it's possible to minimise this boat-like feeling, but I've encountered difficulty when trying to correct turns and oversteer instead. Fishtailing becomes a real problem when careful inputs on the gamepad require ultra precision. However, once you do get used to that feeling, the weight of the cars becomes quite satisfying and at least feels a bit more realistic than in something like Grid. Anyway, so the career mode is par for the course with most racing games. Win races, earn money and driver levels, buy and upgrade new cars, unlock higher tier competitions and ultimately beat all of the champions in each discipline. There's a ton of different races to do and I won't go over all of them, but you can see the progression here. As you go through all of these, you'll be assaulted by a super dude bro kinda guy in many cutscenes, where he attempts to pump you up for each important milestone you hit, or a new opponent on track.
So you're the driver everyone's been talking about?
He's okay. A few other people appear as well to explain and challenge you too, which was a nice addition if you know who they are, but I don't and they just served as the next guy I need to beat. Race categories are broken up into classes based on some kind of score that represents power bands of eligible cars. A stock car has a set class associated with it, D being quite slow and going all the way up to A, then the GT classes 3 and GT1. Some cars such as the GT cars can't be modified beyond their looks. No car can be modified to fit a lower class, but by buying and adding a number of customizable auto parts, you can bring a pretty average street car up to a solid racing standard, raising its score and class sometimes from D all the way up to A. There's a lot of detail in choosing these parts and managing the scores, making sure that you have a good balance of power, braking, handling, weight and not gimping your setup too much. And each of your choices do actually matter and make the cars feel different. A rubbish set of brakes and tyres will absolutely teach you a lesson if you dump a heavy turbo into your car and do an ill-advised engine swap, so watch out for that. Not only do you have all the parts and visual customization that you'd expect, well, the custom livery creation system is a bit naff, honestly. I think it's a step down from the last game, but on PC you can modify that, so it's not so bad. But you also have the ability to make a ton of adjustments to your tuning setup based on the aftermarket parts that you have that let you modify these settings. If you don't have a wing, for example, you can't alter your downforce settings. And speaking of which, this is one of the first games that I've played where I felt like I did actually need to tinker quite a bit with some of these things, which is good for anyone who's interested in that sort of thing, and fairly ignorable for people who aren't. It is possible to compensate for difficult to handle cars by choosing something else or just getting better at driving them. One such example of one of these cars is the McLaren MP4, which I drove a lot, which has an insane handling model and just loves to go sideways at the touch of the throttle. Oversteer in that car is inevitable. But by lowering some tyre pressures and maximising the downforce, I managed to wrestle the car's setup into a controllable state at high speeds and a less awful spinner when it's going slower. This does of course affect its top speed and it does then suffer in that respect, but the only place I had issues with that was on the Nordschleifer's back straight, which is fine because you have 37 corners to maximise the grip through instead. There's a huge variety of circuits to race around with an enormous amount of cars to try out as well. BMW GT3 at Mount Panorama? Hell yeah! How about driving Road America in a Corvette GT1? A classy drive through Monte Carlo in an Aston Martin? Well, if that's not your thing, how does driving a 70s Porsche 911 round Rouen sound? Spa, Brands Hatch, Hockenheim, Laguna Seca, Monza, Suzuka, Donington, Zolder, and so many others feature for good driving in Shift 2. And you can choose the time of day to race now, which is a new feature since the original game, meaning you can get some super slick night races around some of these tracks that change the entire feel of the circuit. There's a huge selection of cars as well, including Ford GTs, classic and modern, Audi R8s, classic 90s Honda NSXs and various Nissan Skylines, Maseratis, McLarens, Jaguars and so many other cars to choose from, modify, tune, fiddle with and then race. If you like cars, I guarantee you're going to find something fun to drive here. A few other things seem overhauled or improved on as well. Drifting wasn't actually half bad in this game, whereas in Shift 1 it was an absolute nightmare. Here it about makes sense and the places they have you drift around are reasonable, with reasonable scores to beat. I'm still not a big drift fan, but this felt pretty tight to me. You can change your on-screen UI to show you, or not if you want, different bits of relevant information. You can turn it off for the immersion, I like to keep the racing line on personally, or you can bring up the telemetry information to bamboozle you with data. It'll show you the state of your tyres, temperatures, where pressure's being put on them, the weight transfer of your car, across your wheels, your throttle inputs, your brake inputs and all sorts of other stuff, which can be useful info in drifting in particular. If you suddenly find that you can't hold a steady drift any longer, you might have blown a tyre or two, so try not to do a bunch of random donuts or burnouts, because it will hurt your performance. This telemetry info is much more useful during endurance races as well, where driving like a moron will absolutely punish you, since the pit lanes don't exist in this game, which is potentially a negative, and you can't therefore replace a set of blown tyres. As long as you do drive sensibly with minimal sideways action though, it's nothing to worry about. But I do appreciate that it's been added in. The AI seems like it's been improved as well in Shift 2. It feels a lot like they have a set variance of lines they can take around the tracks, and they do seem to react well to decisions that you make as long as you're being sensible too. You'll see them attempt to drive defensively, but not too dangerously. Sometimes you'll see one of the guys at the back do something too aggressive, they'll give you room around corners, they might back out of a move if they decide it isn't worth the risk, and quite happily, they won't intentionally try to smash you off the circuit. At least 95% of the time they won't. If you imagine the track as a Scalextric with the ability to swap between the slots, sometimes the AI does randomly decide that it wants to take a different line, and if you're in the way then they might just drive right into you, but at least it's not nearly as bad as it was in the original Shift, and they don't aggressively do that on purpose, and they took out the rewards for driving aggressively as well, so they're really trying to encourage good sportsmanship in Unleashed. A last few notes to mention would be the replays and the helmet cam for the immersion, I guess. It's like having the actual driver's viewpoint from inside the helmet, and you see the view turn automatically to spot apexes and sometimes to look at crashes and things. It can look good, but it feels quite disconnecting since you have no control over where the driver's actually looking. And how about the drag race mode? Not much to say here. Drive in a straight line from a standing start, don't smash into walls and go as fast as possible. They force you to use manual gear shifting here, which is alright, obviously more fun than going automatic because then you're just holding the throttle, but ultimately this mode is quite dull. Oh, and how about sound, which I haven't expressly mentioned, but you should have heard some really satisfying engine sounds throughout this video. Exhaust pops, flame bursts and turbo flutter throughout. It's a thing of beauty. Anyone who likes cars can appreciate sound. That Maserati V12 begs to be unleashed. Huh? Get it? It just screams power. Overall, Shift 2 Unleashed is a huge improvement over Shift 1 and I liked that game as well, so it's only fair to give this one a proper review. I've been Magical Mike, and I'm Quids In with this game as well. Cheers.